Hello, fiendlings. I did say we'd talk again real soon. Since you're back for more, I'll assume your curiosity is piqued. With that in mind, how about another installment? Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 2 of The Black, Arrival.
Cartoon music filled the office. Shoes off, Taz socks in full view, Jay Hollingsworth grinned at the tablet on the desk. He mimicked every word as Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck argued about wabbit season. When Elmer Fudd chimed in, Jay's voice flipped easily into the accent. Mel Blanc would have been proud. He lifted the mug of tea and sipped. The computer screen was still dark. Jay sighed and tapped his fingers on the armrest. His system had been down for the last 10 minutes. Reason? No clue. A help desk message from his phone had resulted in an immediate response, but he knew damn well it would take the tech time to get off his lazy ass. Or it was possible. Just possible that Steve-O was dealing with another issue. Jay smirked. Possible, but highly improbable. The episode ended. That's all, folks, Jay echoed Porky Pig's sign-off. Love to see a professional at work, Kate's voice said from the doorway. Jay swiveled in his chair and pushed his glasses up on his nose. He gestured to the dark screen. It's about all the work I can do right now. He sipped his tea. The liquid was lukewarm at best. Kate smiled. I take it you're waiting for Steve-O? He nodded as his tablet's speakers belted out the Looney Tunes theme song. If by waiting you mean practicing my voice work, yes. Sounded good to me. Always does, though. You're far too kind. He put his feet back on the floor and placed the mug on the desk. So, what's up, Doc? He said in his Bugs voice. Mike said we should go home. The sample is arriving tomorrow afternoon. Wants to make sure we're fresh. And because the night crew doesn't have an assignment? Jay asked. She shrugged. They finished their workload. Was an easy week. Until PPE's vaunted M2 barrel gets here, Jay said. So they won't be joining us for the clusterfuck? Kate clucked her tongue. I could call them in if we need a rest, but Mike would rather... We handle it personally. Yeah, I get it. Tough being a rock star, isn't it? Kate grinned. At least we're paid, he said. PPE asked for us personally, so I guess that's something. Mike said something about a bonus, although I didn't tell you that. Jay harumphed. At least we're getting paid, he said again. He tapped a finger on the desk. Marie joining us? Of course, Kate said. Jay glanced at his mug with longing. Fresh hot tea sounded wonderful, but going home sounded even better. He slipped his feet into his closed-toe sandals. Guess Steve-O doesn't need me here to fix this piece of shit. He closed the tablet and cut off Yosemite Sam in mid-rant. You have Maeve tonight? He asked as he shoved the tablet into his satchel. Kate nodded. Yeah, going to have her tomorrow night too, unless I can find a sitter. What in tarnation? Yosemite Sam's voice said. Exactly. I'll bet you can guess why. Shit. Jay shook his head. Always knew that guy was an asshole. Wish someone had told me that before I married him. She looked up at the ceiling and sighed. No, that's not true. Then I wouldn't have Maeve. Kate looked back at Jay. I guess I came out ahead of the game. A slow smile spread across Jay's face. Probably the best way to look at it. Dare I ask the excuse? New girlfriend. Jay rolled his eyes. And let me guess. You get to break the news. Again. Again, Kate said. Come on, let's get out of here. Rather than taking the elevator, Jay and Kate hiked down the stairwell. Laptop bags around their shoulders, the fabric straps groaned with the weight. Jay was quiet, probably thinking about tomorrow's tests, or maybe which Looney Tunes character he'd break out into next. She sighed. Maeve was going to be pissed. Instead of getting time with her father, the girl was going to spend the weekend cooped up at Hal with no other children. Homework, video games, and the internet would pretty much be her world for at least 48 hours. Kate grinned. Maybe this would be a good thing for her. Time amongst the adults and a chance to see, really see what her mother did for a living. It couldn't be that bad, but she knew she could tell her daughter all the pluses until she was blue in the face. Maeve was going to reject them out of hand. She knew her daughter too well to imagine it going any other way. They reached the bottom of the stairs. Kate swiped her badge across the reader. Without a card, you could exit the building, but not get back inside. The sensor beeped, the lock clicked, and she swung open the door. The building didn't have many visitors. Mike, the CEO, met most of their clients off-site. The visitors they did have were escorted to the third floor by one of the executive team. Therefore, Darren served as their receptionist, and he was on floor 3. The security desk was always helmed by at least one guard. Due to the sensitive nature of their work, Hal chose to hire security personnel as employees rather than employ a third-party firm. It was simply easier that way. As they rounded the corner, Kate saw Jacob Benjamin sitting at the desk. The 20-something looked up and smiled at them. "Done for the day?" He ran a hand through his curly, close-cropped hair. Kate laughed. "For the day. Not for the week." Jacob nodded. "Yeah, I got the memo. I'll be manning things tomorrow night." He pointed at her. "Just for you." She rolled her eyes. "Whatever. I'll have my daughter with me if you need some company." He cocked an eyebrow. "How old is she?" Jay cleared his throat. "Too young for you, horn dog." "That's, not what I mean," Kate laughed. "He's messing with you. She's 13. Jacob said. "She's going to be bored out of her mind, unless you're planning on letting her blow stuff up in the chemistry lab." "She'll be spending the weekend on the second floor. At least that's the plan for now, unless I come up with a miracle." Kate tapped her foot. "Maybe you'll look in on her from time to time?" He ran a hand down the front of his shirt. "Absolutely. I have to do rounds at night anyway. I can do that for you." "Good." Kate looked at Jay. "Ready to beat the traffic?" Jay scrunched up his face. "Darn tootin'." "Okay, Yosemite Sam. Let's do this. See you, Jacob." He waved a hand to them and went back to studying his computer terminal. She wondered exactly what he spent his time doing, but had always been too terrified to ask. As long as Mike didn't care, she shouldn't either. She and Jay headed out of the doors and into the sunlight. A fast-moving blanket of clouds left the world in twilight. Shit. Big storm tomorrow? Yup, Jay said. Should make things fun. Right. Kate smiled at him. Mike's going to page us with a delivery time. He nodded. Then I guess I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. If I can't nap tomorrow, I'll just come in and help Marie get ready. I figured. Until then, madame, he said as Pepe Le Pew. Until then. The new knock. Chuckles flashed his badge at the black rectangular sensor. A small green LED glowed above the panel. He grabbed the door handle and pulled. The heavy steel door swung open on silent hinges. The roar of air conditioning, blade fans, and power supplies slammed into his eardrums. He didn't flinch. Instead, he grinned. Several pairs of full-cover ear protection hung from the wall. Chuckles reached out and grabbed a pair. With his free hand, he pulled off his black flat cap and placed it on the empty cart near the door. The thin strands of hair atop his head fluttered in the strong airflow. The roar died as he pulled on the ear protection. The knock. Servers, network gear, everything. 10 racks of blades, hundreds of terabytes of storage, and all the bandwidth the buildings would ever need. He walked down the row. The dim overheads slowly brightened. The construction company may have fucked up the rest of the building, but at least they got this one right. Exactly as he'd imagined. Although the room wasn't yet networked to the new fiber backbone, he was able to control it from the piece of shit knock in the other building. Not that it really qualified as a network operations center. It was more of a large closet with hellaciously loud machines, terrible cooling, and a network that could barely provide streaming speeds. This was his baby. This room. These servers. All of this was his. 2 years of planning. 2 years of screaming at the CEO for the amount of money they needed. And 2 years of delays, promises, and vendor fuckery. Chuckles nodded to each cabinet as he walked by. The storage appliances were lit up like a racing tree. Greens, yellows, but thankfully no reds. Burn-in. He'd spent the past several days lovingly hooking up each piece of hardware with some help from Steve-O. Now the racks of blades were all running an incredibly dense bioprogram. Neil's team had come up with this one to test their new DNA suite. It calculated mutation probabilities for the damned fruit fly genome. It was math he wasn't capable of comprehending, and it didn't matter. The virtual machines on each blade, 32 per blade, were tied together as a single, monstrous number-crunching unit. The CPU lights were pegged. Chuckles grinned. If they survived crunching the data through the weekend, he'd be happy enough to certify them as ready for action. Which was good, because Neil's team was already chomping at the bit to use them for their DNA studies. The old servers in the other building were proving a little slow. Performing a single run on their molecular models was taking longer each time. When Hal first started offering the service, a single batch took more than 8 hours. Now, with all the data shared across 20 different Cassandra instances, batches took up to 24 hours. Basically, Neil was falling behind. Chuckles petted the nearest cabinet, his skin tingling as it slid down the shining, black metal. "Tomorrow," he said in an accent somewhere between a Texas drawl and a New Jersey nasal grunt, "we'll see if you can handle some more load." He turned his back on the cabinet and headed back toward the heavy knock door. The hearing protection was excellent at muffling the server fan's jet engine decibels and the crackling and crunching of spinning drives, but they were incapable of damping down the heavy vibrations of all those machines running in a tight space. He was still grinning when he closed the server room door and replaced the hearing protection on its peg. He placed his cap back on his head, blew out a sigh, and walked back into the hallway. He knew the knock lights would turn off in a few minutes. Once the motion detectors noticed stillness in the room, they automatically killed the lights to leave the servers doing their work in complete darkness, save for their blinking LED status lights. His pocket vibrated. Chuckles reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out the phone. 5 new alerts. "Fucking piece of shit," he said and walked back toward the sky bridge. The old knock was still the primary and still his problem child. He looked forward to pulling all of those old machines out into the loading dock and beating the ever-loving shit out of them with a sledgehammer. Until then, he'd have to keep the damn systems held together with chewing gum and baling wire. The phrase, one of his father's favorites, bounced around in his head. Face expressionless, Chuckles chuckled. If anyone had been in the hall, they would have thought him insane. Chapter 2. Bugs Bunny was getting the best of Daffy Duck. It was the episode with the abominable snowman, one of Jay's favorites. He reclined in the chair and put his black sneakers up on the desk. Jay loosed a yawn and closed his eyes. As Bugs talked to the snowman, he spoke every line in tandem. Mel Blanc might have voiced the cartoon more than half a century ago, but Jay voiced it now, and damn it if his Bugs and Daffy wasn't spot on. Maybe even better than Mel's. He knew every word, every nuance, every slight lilt or fall of the character's speech. His wife had called him a mimic, but that was the wrong word. Jay didn't mimic. He recreated voices and sounds, and he constantly experimented. He heard the words in his head before he voiced them, and his vocal cords followed suit. It wasn't particularly difficult. Children, like Kate's daughter Maeve, always smiled when he used one of his voices. Didn't matter if it was Bugs, Scooby, or any one of the other 100 voices that weren't his. He could swing his voice from a guttural baritone to a ridiculously helium pitch. The abominable snowman was melting on screen. Jay opened his eyes and grinned. When he was a kid, this was his favorite of the Bugs cartoons. It was still his favorite. Speaking of Maeve, she and Kate would arrive soon. PPE's sample would too. Jay pulled his feet off the desk and paused the video player. He sipped from his large Taz mug and grimaced. The coffee was lukewarm, and that was being kind. He stared down into the brown liquid. Yep, time to throw it out and make a fresh carafe. It was going to be a long, damned night. He reached for the mouse and clicked open the PPE requisition document. The standard list of tests scrolled by. However, there was one oddity. Light test, he said to the room. It wasn't the strangest thing he'd seen on a requisition. Offshore drilling often led to the odd test. When a company drilled an exploration well in thousands of feet of water, they wanted to run every test they could. PPE wasn't the first to drill in over 30,000 feet of water, but they were the company everyone was watching. The more test results they had, the more they could lie to the stockholders about what they'd found. Well, that was unkind. Not all assay releases were lies. Just most of them. Every employee at HAL signed non-disclosure agreements. It didn't matter if you were the chief scientist or a janitor. The lawyers insisted on it. So did the industry itself. No one wanted their secrets getting out into the world. Not that it helped much. Industrial espionage was rife within the oil industry. Offshore, onshore, it didn't matter. The larger the possible find, the more interest by competitors. If a licensed area showed promise to one company, it was a safe bet others would try and muscle in as close to the find as possible. It was all a crapshoot, of course. One company could find a gold mine in one well and nothing but dead holes just a few hundred meters away. PPE was exploring a newly discovered trench called M2. It wasn't actually newly discovered, but that's how they were marketing it. It had been found over 2 years ago, but PPE hadn't gotten their act together until recently. The sample was from their first exploratory well. Jay knew all eyes would be on the lab now. PPE was paying a small ransom to get fast answers. He knew why, too. Stockholders have little patience. They have even less foresight. If a company spends $1 billion on licensing fees and the creation of a new rig, they want to see oil flowing. They want to hear how a production rig is going to be sent out immediately to drill, baby, drill. Only the black gold assuages their need for instant gratification. And corporate executives can only make so many forward-looking statements before the street calls bullshit. Jay watched the industry like a hawk. Didn't matter if it was something as cataclysmic as Shell restating the value of their reserves in Saudi, or Schlumberger inventing a new tool. The news mattered. It directly related to Hal's success. One day, he'd actually want to retire. Maybe set himself up in Alaska at a fishing resort, become a guide and fish the hell out of sockeye. Then, in winter, he could come back to Houston to hide from the brutal cold. Jay smiled. He rose from his chair, grabbed the mug, and headed toward the break room. Time to make more coffee. Time to prep the tests PPE had asked for. And more importantly, time to see what magic Marie had done. Marie was his and Kate's assistant. She was only 3 years out of her PhD degree, but she was good. Not great, but good. She'd learn. Jay was sure that by the time he and Kate retired, Marie would be able to run the lab by herself. He headed out of his office into the brightly lit, sterile hallway. Jay yawned. His clipped footsteps echoed off the tiled walls. Hal felt more like a morgue or hospital than a chem lab. At least that's how Jay had always seen it. The new building would be better, but it was another few months before the company could relocate most of the staff. Hal owned 2 buildings. The first, the one they presently staffed, was built to handle both biological samples as well as chemical. On the biological side, Hal had never handled anything virulent or inherently dangerous. The bio side primarily focused on mineral and soil samples. Once offshore drilling began in earnest, the company reorganized. The last decade had been a bonanza in terms of petrochemical analysis. Requisitions for oil assays had pushed Hal to run a 24-hour, 5-day-a-week business. But their building was busting at the seams. The executives bought the nearby lots and started construction on a new, larger, more modern building. The recession and subsequent bankruptcy of several building contractors had put the schedule into hellish delay. So every day, the employees of Hal had to look at the mostly built hulk of the new building while heading into their familiar, run-down home. Jay entered the break room and sniffed the air. The ghostly scent of ground beans filled his nostrils. He smiled and headed to the coffee maker. Both carafes were empty. He knew that. He'd emptied both of them. But, being a bastard, he hadn't bothered refilling either. Since it was late afternoon, there was little need. Until now. He pulled out the basket, popped in a fresh filter, and shook in the grounds. He placed one of the carafes below and punched the button. Lights blinked, water steamed, and Jay was in heaven. When you spent most of your workdays around volatile chemicals, you learned to appreciate certain smells. The chemists wore masks and protective clothing when on the job, but that didn't mean you still didn't get the acerbic stench of chemicals up your nose, especially if you were dealing with crude. Sulfur, acetone, benzine, you name it, crude could have it. As bad as the oil might stink, Some of the reagents used for testing were worse. Spend all day in that olfactory hell, and you came to appreciate the little things. For Jay, that was definitely coffee. Light test. Right. He pulled his cell from his pocket and messaged Marie. You got the test list? A few seconds later, Marie responded in the affirmative. Jay nodded to himself and pocketed the phone. The coffee was ready. He emptied his mug, washed out the crap, and refilled it. With a fresh 16 ounces of black, he left the break room and headed down the hall. The stairwell was 3 flights of concrete and a steel railing. He took the steps to the lower level with care. The building had an elevator for the disabled and the just plain lazy, but he never used it. Jay glanced at the small glass windows high on the wall. Wan sunlight filtered through them. In no time at all, the sun would set and night would settle in. Jay reached the fire door and waved his badge in front of the reader. The heavy steel door clicked. He pulled on the handle and walked into the first-floor hallway. The labs were located at the other end of the building. That way, if there was some kind of fire or chemical leak, those in the offices on the second floor wouldn't be affected. Jay clomped down the hallway until he reached the entryway to the 2 labs. The phrase, "Authorized personnel only," was etched into the glass door. He flashed his badge in front of the card reader. The glass slid aside, and he walked through. 2 metal doors stood on either side of the hallway. Jay sipped from the mug and then placed a hand on the fingerprint scanner. The scanner beeped as it took a photo of his fingers. He sighed and waited the requisite 5 seconds before the scanner beeped again and a green light appeared on the wall. Using his free hand, he pulled on the door handle. The door swung open to the side and he walked into a small, glass-walled room that faced the actual lab. It was a changing area, as well as for brief breaks between long-running tests. Jay took another sip of coffee and let his nose linger over the cup. The steaming mug helped blot out the palpable scent of solvents and crude. Jay put his coffee on the credenza. He eyed the row of lab coats hanging from metal hooks. Thursday night's crew hadn't had theirs cleaned yet. No wonder the place stank. A sign on the wall said no food or drink. Jay wrinkled his nose at it and scanned the equipment cubbies. Masks, check. Booties for footies, check. Gloves? Check. Marie had no doubt already been through the checklist. She was meticulous, even if she lacked the confidence to realize it. He looked out into the lab. The floor tiles were stained with every color of the rainbow. No matter how many times they scrubbed it, the caustic chemicals had permanently marked them. The new building, 30 years newer than this one, would have stain-proof tiles and a much friendlier cleaning regimen. At Hal, the chemists were responsible for everything in the lab, including the janitorial side. Bringing in custodial staff was a security no-no. Marie had prepped the area. Jay went through the tests in his mind. X-ray machine was ready. Slides were ready. Fluoroscope was clean. And in the back was the equipment for the light test. He pulled his phone out and checked the time. Maeve and Kate should be in the parking lot. He clucked his tongue, picked up his mug, and headed back out through the security doors.